Well, good morning. Go ahead and grab your Bible and join me in Philippians chapter 3. And it's good to see you today. We're glad you're here with us. And if you need a Bible this morning, there's one there in the pew in front of you. That's for you to use. And if you need a little help finding Philippians chapter 3, you can turn to page 1041 in that pew Bible, and you'll be there with the rest of us. Well, I don't want to go too far this morning before I just point out, I know there's people hurting all across this room today. Some of you are going through a very difficult time. And so if you happen to be sitting next to an Alabama fan, would you just give them a hug, just a side hug? Just let them know that you love them anyway. We've been where they've been for a long time. And my favorite part, honestly, yesterday was watching all the videos. I don't know if you were able to, if you have a way to watch videos, that's the thing. People, usually their husband's acting a fool. You have the wife in the corner, taping it on her phone, or, your children or whoever's watching the game, just watching them dancing and celebrating and rejoicing over this kind of unexpected, win. And most Tennessee wins are unexpected wins. And yesterday was surely one of those as you begin watching the game. And when I started thinking about that, just the amount of joy, and really that is, in a much serious, deeper way, that is the Christian life. The Christian life should be one of great joy, should be one of rejoicing. And when I think about this letter, the book of Philippians that Paul wrote to the church in Rome, remember he's writing from a prison. It's just so interesting that that's one of the themes of the letter, joy and rejoicing. There are 104 verses in the book of Philippians, and in 16 times in those verses, he talks about joy or rejoicing. 9 times he commands them to rejoice. And I just want you to think about that for a moment. That should be one of the underlying emotions, feelings, realities, perhaps, maybe that's the better word, realities of the life of a Christian, is that we rejoice. And it doesn't mean that Paul was, running around with spirit fingers all the time. He experienced difficult days. We know Paul went through some hard times where he grieved and experienced loss. Okay, so this joy and rejoicing that we see throughout the letter is not one that just looks at difficult times and just kind of pans over them, does some kind of psychological gymnastics and doesn't understand the weight of them. No, this underlying joy is something that's rooted much deeper than those pains of life go. It's an underlying joy and rejoicing that's available for every Christian because our hearts are anchored to a deeper reality than just the day-to-day struggles of life. Because once again, those are going to happen. The Christian life is not one where there's no pain and hardship. If anything, if you read through the scriptures, honestly, you see that being a Christian can be very difficult. The path can even be harder, can't it? But the call to follow Jesus and deny ourselves is accompanied by this freedom that comes from loosening the chains of the things that other people look for joy and acceptance and approval for in this world and finding there's something much better in Jesus. And this is what we see Paul pointing out to the believers here in Philippi as he writes to them here, specifically in chapter 3. He's calling them to rejoice. And then he's going to warn them about some things that can still their joy. And so let's read these words together. Chapter 3, verse 1, Paul writes these words. He says, "In addition, my brothers and sisters, rejoice in the Lord. To write to you again about this is no trouble for me and is a safeguard for you. Watch out for the dogs. Watch out for the evil workers. Watch out for those who mutilate the flesh. For we are the circumcision, the ones who worship by the Spirit of God. Boast in Christ Jesus and do not put confidence in the flesh. Although I have reasons for confidence in the flesh, If anyone else thinks he has grounds for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised the 8th day, of the nation of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, regarding the law, a Pharisee, regarding zeal, persecuting the church, regarding the righteousness that is in the law, blameless. But everything that was a gain to me, I have considered to be a loss because of Christ. More than that, I also consider everything to be a loss in view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. Because of him, I have suffered the loss of all things and consider them as dung, so that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own from the law, but one that is through faith in Christ. The righteousness from God is based on faith. Paul calls them to rejoice. And this rejoicing, this joy that we're to have as Christians, it's not something that we can give ourselves, okay, right? This is something that God gives us in the gospel. It's not something we just work up in ourselves, some emotional fit. No, it's something that God gives us through his son, Jesus Christ. So we can't obtain this in and of ourselves, but we do have a responsibility to guard it, in a way to protect it. And notice what Paul says to them in verse 2. What he's about to share with them, it's something he's shared with them before. He says that to write you again about this is no trouble for me, to write these same things again. And one person has said that every church should be a church about the same things. That as we gather here to worship, we should continually be rejoicing and reminding and encouraging each other in the same things, the good news of the gospel. And he's doing this as a safeguard for them, as to protect them. There are those out there who are seeking to infiltrate their ranks, to come into the church. False teachers were traveling around trying to impose upon the Gentiles within the church that they must adhere to the Jewish law, specifically to be circumcised. They came to know Christ out of a pagan background. Okay, so within the church in Philippi, you had Jews and Gentiles, probably mostly Gentiles here in the church in Philippi. And so some of them didn't come out of the same Jewish background, and so they were not circumcised. So for a Jew to be circumcised meant it was a sign of being a part of God's covenant people. It was absolutely necessary. So you had these Jewish leaders coming from Jerusalem, and then you have these Gentiles in the church in Philippi, and the Jewish leaders are saying, listen, it's not enough. The gospel is not enough. No, you must also be circumcised. And Paul is addressing this, and he's saying these are false teachers. They're the ones who are there, and they're seeking to steal your joy. And so it is for anyone. Listen, anything that causes us to lean on it instead of Jesus and Jesus alone, that compromises the gospel. And so any religion, any misthinking, even within this room, listen, the baptism that we celebrated this morning, that is an extremely important step of obedience for a Christian. But it doesn't add anything to the salvation that Jesus has already given us on the cross and through his resurrection. It does not add one thing. And this is true for any belief or any religion or line of thought that says that you can be right with God in another way or in addition to Jesus. Listen, that's a false religion. That's a false teaching. And we need to stand on that as Bible-believing Christians. And this is tough in today's pluralistic society, isn't it? I mean, it sounds very narrow to believe that Jesus is the only way to God. And my friends, it is narrow. We believe in a narrow gospel. But it's a gracious and good and generous gospel, for it's available for anyone who believes. And if you take the approach, well, it's okay if you believe in something else as long as you're sincere, then you run the risk. You don't run the risk, you cheapen the gospel. In fact, this is what Paul says as he's writing to the believers in the churches in the region of Galatia, in Galatians 2:21. He says, I do not set aside the grace of God in the gospel, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died for nothing. If you believe that someone can be made right with God in another way other than the death and the resurrection of Jesus, then what you are saying, what you're believing, is that Jesus died for nothing. That ultimately he did not have to die. And that's a very serious accusation. And so what Paul is dealing with here is very, very serious in the life of the church of Philippi. And he's writing to them to warn them. And notice what he says there in verse 2. He uses this incredibly harsh language. First of all, he tells them to watch out, and he says it 3 times. He says, watch out for these dogs. Watch out for these evil workers. Watch out for those who mutilate the flesh. Right? That's what we do as parents. We repeat ourselves for our kids so they understand the seriousness of what we're about to communicate to them. That's exactly what we see Paul here doing. He says, watch out for these dogs. These dogs in this day were considered unclean. They were linked to all those things that oppose God. Now, it's hard for us to believe this, but yes, if your mini golden doodle was alive in the first century, they would be unclean, okay? Unholy to God. Dogs were scavengers. They were thrown unclean things, and they were unclean. And so Paul is saying these Jewish leaders that are coming in and trying to teach this false gospel that you have to be circumcised, they're unclean like dogs. He also calls them evil workers. They're agents of Satan himself. They're working against God. They're anti-God. They're destined for judgment. And then finally, look what he calls them. He says they are those who mutilate the flesh. And once again, there's a real reason, right? They're promoting circumcision as a way to be part of God's people. But even more than that, this idea carries the connotation of those pagan religions back in the Old Testament. Remember when Elijah was confronting the prophets of Baal. The prophets of Baal are trying to call down to their God, right, to bring the fire down from heaven, and they begin cutting themselves. They begin to mutilate their own flesh as an act of sacrifice to God. And in a way, he's saying these Jews that are coming in and telling them they have to be circumcised, they're no better than these pagan prophets of Baal who mutilate their own flesh. He says, watch out for these. And it's interesting because as we've been looking through this letter in Philippians, you know, one of the constant calls Paul has told the church is for them to be unified, for them to stand in one accord, that they are to look at the interest of others, put the other interest of others before their own. But yet here we see Paul doing the exact opposite. He's calling out these false teachers. In other words, there were lines that Paul would not cross to be unified, to walk in one accord within the church. And one of those lines are these core doctrines about the gospel, about Jesus Christ. If someone comes in preaching distorting the gospel of Jesus Christ, saying you need something else other than Jesus than to be made right with God, then my friends, you're to reject these people. These are not from God. Even he would say in Galatians, even if it's an angel, right, from heaven, don't believe it. They're not from God. This kind of thinking will undermine the gospel and completely wreck the church that Paul dearly loved if they begin to walk in one accord. These are teachings, these false teachings. And he goes on to say, listen, the mark of a Christian is not physical circumcision, but it's a work of the Spirit. Look again what he says there in verse 3. He says, for we are the circumcision. What is he saying here? He said, for we're the people who are actually the covenant people of God. It's not those who walk in the flesh because of circumcision, but it's those who worship by the Spirit of God, or that word worship, probably better translated here, would be serve. Those who serve by the Spirit of God, we're the ones who have truly been changed. We're the ones who truly belong to God. And as a result, we boast in Jesus. Our hope and our confidence is in Jesus. It's not in the flesh. So a mark of the believer is not this outward expression or thing that's done by human hands. No, it's a work of God, the Spirit in the life of a believer, right? Applying what God has done in the gospel to the life of the believer. And so our boast is not in ourselves, Paul would say, but it's in Jesus Christ. And it's not in our confidence is not in the things that we have achieved. It's not in these worldly measures of what often religion points to as someone who's right with God. And my friends, don't we deal with that here in the church in America? I mean, we do. And so this is a word, this is really a word for Christians, for those of us who've grown up in the church this morning. I believe that if we're not careful, we can create a brand of Christianity that doesn't need a Savior. And many of us in the church, if we're not careful, will be guilty of that very thing. Paul grew up in that kind of thinking, that kind of culture. And he points this out in his resume here in verses 4 through 6. He kind of lists some things. If Paul were applying to be a good person or a person who's right with God, he would say, here's my credentials. And notice the first thing he says. First of all, he says that he was circumcised on the 8th day. In other words, from his very birth, he was a true Israelite. He wasn't someone who came in from an outside religion or an outside people. No, he was born. They're a true Israelite, circumcised on the 8th day. Even before he could even do anything himself, make a decision as a baby, he was religious. And in the same way, many of us have been born in church culture, haven't we? I mean, I've logged more hours in the church than anywhere else in my life. As a child, as my profession, I was in the church when I was 2 weeks old. Even before then, within my mom's belly, my dad was the minister of music. My mom sang in the choir, and you just didn't miss. Okay, you were there Sunday mornings, you were there Sunday nights, you were there Wednesday nights. Much of my life was spent in the church, and same thing today. We have a baby dedication service. So very early on, right, we're placed in this culture where there's this sense that we're religious, that we're good people. Paul also says that he was from the tribe of Benjamin. This tribe had a special place in the eyes of Jews. This was the tribe where Saul himself, right, the first king of Israel, came from the tribe of Benjamin. This is also one of the tribes that after the reign of Solomon, when it was split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, this was the tribe of Benjamin stayed within the nation of Judah, right? Stayed true to the Davidic line of the Davidic king. And so this was a very significant marker for a Jew that he was from the tribe of Benjamin. The same thing for us, right? Not only are we born here, many of us have been raised in the church, but it's also the church here in America, the church here in the South. We live in a culture to a certain extent, that has a flavor of Christianity. Barna did a study not too long ago, and they were listing the most biblically minded cities in the country. And 3 of the top 10 were right here in Tennessee. Chattanooga, I think the Tri-Cities, I think Knoxville. Jackson may not have been big enough to be qualified, but I'm assuming we would be right there. So not only are you born here in America, you're born in the South probably. You're here now. You may have been raised in one of these cities in Tennessee where we're very biblically minded. Paul also writes that he was a Hebrew of Hebrews. That means his parents were Hebrews. He knew the Hebrew language. He was well acquainted with their customs. He was not polluted by Greek influence. Jews outside of Jerusalem often would be Hellenized. They would adopt Greek culture. Paul's saying, I didn't do that. Right? I stayed true to my Hebrew roots. Same way as Christians here in America. We know the whole system, don't we? I grew up in church, so I knew the morals even before I became a Christian. I knew how, in a way, to act like a Christian. Paul would go on to say that he was a Pharisee. As a Pharisee, he had memorized, if not all, most of the New Testament. This would have been the strictest sect amongst the Jews. They even added their own oral laws and traditions to the written law, seeking to cultivate this priestly level of purity that would usher in a renewal of the nation. Right? The Pharisees, they were so against Jesus' followers and the way because they saw it as a threat to their job, their role in keeping the purity of the nation, right? Ushering in the new kingdom. In the same way, listen, I knew the word early. right? Even before I could read, we give kids, Bibles at 5 years old. Right? They can't read it, but they've got it in their hand. I grew up in Sunday school, learning the verses, Bible drill, all those things. And if I